What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and we use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week we are reading The Obelisk Gate by N.K. Jemisin, which is part 2 of the fantasy trilogy The Broken Earth. We did part 1 last season, so if you haven't listened to that one yet, head on over there.
And as a fair warning, we will be talking about the entirety of The Obelisk Gate, so there will be spoilers for this book as well as the previous book, the 5th season. However, we won't touch on book 3 because neither of us have read it. So this is your official warning. If you care about spoilers, hit pause, go read the book, come back later. And if you don't care about spoilers or you've already read, welcome to the party.
Welcome! If you would like to support us, you can rate, review, and subscribe on any and all podcast platforms. If you check it down in the show notes, anytime there's a book that's linked, it'll be linked to our affiliate page on bookshop.org, which sources from local bookstores in the US. And anytime you buy a book using one of those links, it doesn't have to be that book. It can be any book. But from our affiliate page, we get a very small kickback, and that helps us buy books as well. And then finally, if you'd like to join the book club, become a member for newsletters, giveaways, we have a new film club series that we're trying out. We watched Pachinko, the TV series, and talked about the adaptation from the book, all that fun stuff. Completely unfiltered, unedited, is just our raw emotions, reactions. If you would like to be a part of that, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. It's $3 a month for the basic, and then $5 a month for the autism tier if you want my essays and tips and tricks on autism-related stuff. Whew, okay, I did it.
Great job. You did it.
Thank you.
Yeah. This is very exciting. We are in our 10th season as of today. This is the 10th season of our podcast,
welcome.
Which is incredible.
It's crazy.
I feel like there's very few projects in my life that I can say I've done 96 times. We're on episode 96.
Yeah, dude.
So it's very exciting. And we'll be hitting our 100th episode this season. So stay tuned for some fun shenanigans to celebrate 100 episodes because big round numbers are fun.
Yeah, we're getting close to a round number on our Spotify subscribers, and it's completely arbitrary, but I just go like, oh, we're so close, and I get so excited by it. It's so silly.
My partner always like kind of rolls his eyes when it's like, oh, it's like a big deal because it's, someone's 25th birthday or like the 40th anniversary of whatever. And he's like, oh yeah, it's big. It's divisible by 5. Like that's... He's like, why can't 26 be exciting or 43 or just a Tuesday? But yeah, we like big round numbers and it's 3 digits. Yeah.
It's a big deal. So be on the lookout for that. That's coming up very soon.
I'm excited for all the books we have this season. Like I am most seasons. It was fun picking books, especially knowing that we could so immediately jump back into the world of N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy. Sometimes we take a couple seasons to like follow up with sequels and whatnot, but Julie and I were like ready. We were like, we have purchased for you the audiobook, for me the ebook. We are going to read. We're going to dig into this immediately. So yeah, Julie, what was your experience reading the second book?
Okay, yeah, as you said, I raved so much last time about how much I liked the audiobook reader, and so I decided to listen to this one as well. But it took me a lot longer. I mean, not that long, but I listened to 5th season in like a day. It was like 24 hours, whereas this one I read over like a week or two. There were a few reasons. One, I didn't have a migraine, which is great. That meant I was doing other things and not laying in the dark with nothing else to do. So, I would be doing something else at the same time, or I would have to go in and out of classes or whatever. Two, a lot of this book is like talking, based on the physical constraints of theirs in one place. And it's a lot of like politics and they're just talking or like explaining really complicated like science-y, magic-y stuff. It's kind of theory stuff. And I couldn't do something at the same time when I was listening. Sometimes when I was listening to one of those chapters, I would have to like stop whatever I was doing and like go lay down and close my eyes so that I could actually absorb what they were saying because it was kind of complex. So that kind of limited when I could listen to it. And then I had a really hard time at first, and for most of the book, like psyching myself up to read the Nasun chapters because they were really upsetting to me.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, but especially when she sort of, for lack of a better, like imprinted on Shafa and decided he was her new father. It took me a long time to feel okay reading it. So I had to make sure I was in the right headspace. I was like prepared for those chapters because it was really hard to read. As good as they were. Like they were very, very good. And I ended up with much more complicated feelings than I started with. I started with just like, no, I hate this guy. It makes me so angry. And by the end I was like, God damn it. This is, okay. All right, Jemisin. All right, I trust you. It took a while. So, overall, I loved the book. I think maybe slightly less than the first one, but still really good. And I felt very vindicated that my theory about the moon was sort of correct.
Yeah.
They didn't break the moon. They flung it like a slingshot out of orbit, but I was right about the moon.
I immediately downloaded the second book right after I finished reading the first book. And I was like, I'm going to immediately jump into this. But then I read a few chapters and like put it aside because I got distracted by other books, namely Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. And I realized I can't be in two fantasy worlds at the same time.
Yes.
Like I'm not quite there yet with my reading prowess. And so I was like, okay, one at a time here. And then I picked up some like nonfiction that I was reading for a while and whatnot. So Julia basically yelled at me over WhatsApp being like, please finish this book now. We need to discuss. Also, SOS, the episode recording is next week. So like, please have the book done. And I'm like, you are right. And so then in like the span of a week, I like blew through the whole thing. But you're right. Yeah, there's a lot of just like sitting and the characters do a lot of like sitting and talking. And like you said, the constraints of their situation in their world is that you can't really go outside. Very quarantine-esque feels to this.
Honestly.
And so that means there is a lot less movement as far as setting goes compared to the previous book. Also, all of this book, for the most part, is taking place, like, all at the same time. You're flipping between Asun and Nasun's point of view, and you get these interludes from Hoa. But otherwise, it's all happening in the present, whereas in book one, we had all the mystery of who were these three different characters. Oh, wow, they're all the same person. And they were happening at three different points in that character's life. So, it was a little different, but ultimately, I really enjoyed it. And I'm really excited for our discussion today.
Yeah. So we already did an author bio about N.K. Jemisin last time, but you look like you've got some more new things. So what's up?
Yeah, a few things to remember about Jemisin we talked about when we introduced her as an author in the 5th season episode. We'll link that in the show notes if you want to go listen back to that one. But she's an American author of sci-fi and fantasy. And very notably, she was the first author to win 3 Hugos in a row, and the first author to win Hugos for all 3 novels of a trilogy.
Wow.
This wasn't her first publication. She was already very, like, her debut novels caused a lot of attention. The Broken Earth trilogy kind of slingshotted her into the forefront of, like, everyone's mind, to the point that, like, Julie and I know who she was, and we didn't even read like adult fantasy at the time.
Yeah.
And she has since gone on to write more and more books, including, which I'm very excited to read at some point, as she's been writing, or she was writing like 2019 to 2021, a comic series for DC.
Ooh.
Based off of, I think it was like a spin-off kind of Green Lantern, Far Sector. And I believe the main character is a Green Lantern, but I know nothing about Green Lantern, if that's like a thing in the DC universe that multiple people are.
So I think there's a lot of them, technically.
Yeah.
But I think the main guy is also called the Green Lantern, so I don't know.
Same. Don't know much, but I'm curious to read. I haven't read like any DC comics, but I've been reading more comics lately, so. But among other things she's working on, this was very exciting. I missed this when I was putting together my author bio for the last episode, but in summer 2021, Sony announced a 7-figure deal to turn the Broken Earth trilogy into a film series, and the most exciting part to me is Jemisin herself is adapting the novels to screen.
Oh, hell yeah. Excellent choice.
The fall of 2021, Michael B. Jordan was announced as one of the co-producers. And this was a quote in an interview with Entertainment Weekly about her work on Far Sector for DC Comics, but they took like a pivot to talk about the Broken Earth trilogy films that she is adapting. So this is a little bit about her process adapting these novels into a screenplay. She says, "It's difficult to describe, but for example, a lot of my characters' growth and development occurs in internal ways. They will have epiphanies. They will have a moment of revelation where they suddenly understand a thing. That can be a dramatic moment in a book because that moment of understanding is a beat in the character arc. You can get inside their head and you can make that dramatic or powerful or important. You can't do that in a film. You can't do it in a comic book because we can't see inside their head. You have to make that moment of revelation visual and physical. And they can talk through some of that revelation, but at the end of the day, there has to be a physical, visual thing that happens that changes this person. So now I have to come up with events instead of epiphanies."
Interesting.
So I imagine book 2 is going to be very different as a film because someone's just sitting around and thinking and practicing. And I'm really curious how they're going to portray orogeny and magic in the film because it is such like when the other characters who aren't origins are watching an origin, they're just standing there.
Yeah.
And like they aren't doing anything. And the Fulcrum actually trained Esun to stand a particular way when she's doing something so as to not scare the stills, but to let them know like, hello, I'm doing something now. So I'm really curious how this book will change when it's adapted to film. Not only the whole series, but especially the second book because it's very philosophical and ideological.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, dude, there's a lot of things I'm like, how? I can't even picture how this works in my mind. How are they possibly going to make that visual in a film? But I'm excited. I hope they do a good job.
Me too.
I also feel like for our discussion today, it's relevant to point out that she was a counselor, a psychologist for many years.
Yes, I missed that. I got too excited about the film, but yes, it's very important. So N.K. Jemisin's first career was as a counseling psychologist, has her master's degree in counseling and was counseling full-time while she was writing many of her early novels. And in 2016, which is right around the time that this second book came out, she was able to quit her job and pursue writing full-time.
Yeah, because it's very, very relevant to her work. And it comes up in the themes. So we will be talking about trauma-related, psychological-related things. Okay, so this summary felt a little unusual in structure, but I'm going to give it a go. So this book takes place in 2 main locations, now that the 5th season is fully set in, right? So everyone's got to hunker down in one spot. One is Esun's storyline in Castrima, that's the underground comm, where she's trying to learn how to control the obelisks from Alabaster, who's dying. He's her former mentor / lover, and the guy who broke the continent in half and started the 5th season. So that's Alabaster. He's slowly turning to stone, and he's teaching her how to use these obelisks. And Esun, she's also trying to survive the 5th season, so she's trying to learn to work with a comm again and to trust people. And she becomes closer with Ika, the head woman of Castrima, who is also an origin, but she taught herself orogeny. Okay, so then the other location, the other storyline, is with Nasun, Esun's daughter, whose father, Jija, he's the one who killed her little brother Uche at the beginning of book 1. He realizes that she's an origin too, and he takes her south to a comm in the Antarctics that he's heard rumors of can supposedly cure her orogeny. And that's where Nasun meets Shafa. He appears again. Surprise, you thought he was dead. He's not. It's Esun's former guardian. He was really abusive. He broke her hand. He survived the big boat explosion at the end of book 1 through some mysterious force. that you sort of slowly learn about throughout the book. And he's set up this sort of alternative training site for young origins. It's hard to tell what exactly he's doing, but he essentially set up his own version of a little fulcrum. So Nasun, because her father's, hates her now, but hates her orogeny now, Nasun gets very attached to Shafa while they train together. So that kind of changes her loyalties, her priorities. So over the course of the book, Esun and Nasun are both learning a lot about orogeny. That's like a huge part of the plot. And the obelisks, and how the obelisks actually run on magic. So they discover this other layer to orogeny that's magic, and it connects all living things. And they both learn to use the obelisks for their orogeny. Nasun uses this power to kill her father and to do some things to try and please Shafa, and she makes some mistakes. And then Esun uses it to, basically their Kastrima is under attack from this rival Calm is trying to take all their resources, and she uses the obelisk to protect them. She wipes out an army and the whole rival Calm, actually. And in the end, they are both, because they have this power, they're both recruited by different factions of Stone Eaters to try and help end this bigger war that's happening between a bunch of different sides that we'll get into later. We don't fully understand, but it's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. And they're basically being recruited. They got to use the obelisks to wrangle the moon back into orbit. Yeah, which is crazy. So that's the plot. It's a lot of learning and training and politics.
And trauma, we'll get into. Or dealing with trauma. Or
oh yeah.
Recognizing trauma. Okay, so in our discussion today, we're going to focus on a few of the new things that we learn about in this book. So magic, a deeper understanding of the relationship between orogeny and trauma, and then the bigger ideologies, kind of those factions Julia mentioned that are ruling this war over the earth. Over the stillness is what it's called.
Yeah, because against the earth, but also for the earth, it's complicated.
Yeah, capital E earth. What?
Yeah.
So there's a lot in here, but one of the big, huge new concepts in this book is magic. And it's fascinating because when we are first introduced to the concept, it's kind of a dramatic moment because Alabaster's trying to teach Esun everything he knows, but he's very weak and he's dying, and also has never taught anyone anything. So he's kind of terrible at it and just kind of expects her to know things and just rambles at her and forces her to do things that maybe she's not, doesn't know what she's doing yet. But what he does understand in his research, and he was brought to the other side of the world for a while and lived with Stone Eaters.
Yeah.
So he learned a lot while he was there. And one of the things is this, everyone who can see it describes it as this, silvery substance that you can see in living things, especially humans and obelisks. And it is called this term that everyone has forgotten and no one has heard of before, called magic. I find it super fascinating that Jemisin did not come up with a new term like she did for orogeny, but instead uses a term that fantasy readers will understand.
Have a bunch of associations with.
Yeah, we already have a lot of preconceived notions of what magic would be. So that's interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
But we're also realizing, and the characters realize throughout the course of the book, that interacting with magic is a different experience than those who have been Fulcrum trained interact with orogeny.
Yeah. I think the fact that she used the term magic gave me a harder time understanding, are these two things different? Are orogeny and magic different? Or is one sort of a different, are they two different versions of the same thing? Or is one an offshoot of an evolution of another? I had a really hard time because the way that Jemisin talks about orogeny and magic is very technical and very scientific. And it's she really gets into what's happening inside your mind when you're doing something magical, which is not something most fantasy writers do. Most fantasy writers, you feel the effort of what you're doing in your body and then you see the result. But there's no like theory of like what you're, seeing inside the thing and like what is it made of and how does it work with your brain? Not a lot of people do that. And so she sort of science-ifies magic. And so coming at it from that direction was like really hard for me to wrap my head around. But something that you said when I was complaining to you about this, I was like, I don't understand. You talked about sort of different approaches to knowledge, or even what we might call science, or the different ways of understanding the natural world, where we have empirical methods, right, of like quote unquote trying to be objective and testing and kind of separating everything into little pieces to analyze them and that kind of thing, versus intuitive knowledge of like it's more experiential. It's like, what do you just know? What do you feel in your body? What relationships do you have with the natural world? Like that kind of thing. There's sort of different ways of knowing similar truths. And they can both be separate and they can both work together with the same materials.
Yeah.
And so that idea really, really helped me, because I was like, okay, I think that makes sense to me.
And even as you're talking about it now, I'm thinking of how maybe some other comparisons to things that those of us who are not origins may be able to relate to. So for example, I think of language and grammar. So as a native speaker of English, I have a very intuitive sense of what grammar makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. When I formulate a sentence, I'm not thinking about what parts of speech everything is. I'm thinking about I just go straight to the communication, and it's very intuitive. However, if I'm trying to speak Spanish, I'm not a native Spanish speaker by any means. And I have a very empirical knowledge of it because I learned in a classroom what different parts of speech were, how sentences are ordered. And those are both truths. What I learned in the classroom was Spanish, but the way I approach it is very like analytical, of like trying to fit verbs together with the correct conjugations and whatever. Similar to, even if you are a native English speaker, but you're really interested in how grammar functions, maybe you spend a lot of time in linguistics classes and like learning the science of the language. And then you have that very empirical and intuitive knowledge, combined. And perhaps that makes you a more powerful writer or reader or speaker because you have kind of the combined knowledge, instead of like, well, I just make my sentence that way because it sounds right to me. That's kind of how I was breaking down like this empirical versus intuitive, of like how the book is talking about these things that are related, but just different approaches towards that knowledge.
And you get the impression also that in terms of chronology, magic was first. Mm-hmm. And then orogeny was sort of developed after the earth kind of blew up, and all of a sudden it was really volatile and you had to be able to control the shakes and stuff, and so it might have kind of evolved, or like the fulcrum's way of doing things maybe evolved to just do what they needed origins to do, which is control the ground, and so that they could live on it. Maybe they didn't want origins to have a greater understanding of how magic works, and that it's actually in everything to greater or lesser degrees, and it can work in different ways, and you can work together on it, and because that would make them more powerful. So, yeah, I think it's maybe evolved over time, and that's why they forgot the original magic part. Mm-hmm. But not everyone.
Yeah, a really good example of like these two different approaches we see in Essun and Ika. So Ika, remember, is the head woman of the Kam Kristrima, and she grew up there. And this community was oddly very welcoming when she found out, like realized she was an origin, and didn't kick her out, didn't ostracize her, and she became their leader. And especially living in an underground geode, they needed the power of an origin to keep the place stable. And Essun is really like flabbergasted that Ika can do some really powerful things, but also seems to be like so quote unquote feral, like she doesn't have the fulcrum training. So feral is any origin that wasn't born in the fulcrum, or like bred, from fulcrum trained origins. And there's a moment where Essen finally kind of realizes, like, oh, what Ika's doing is just different. It's not necessarily like inadequate. There's a great quote towards the end, chapter 19. This is Essen thinking, maybe she couldn't shift a pebble because who the rest needs to shift pebbles? That's the fulcrum's way of testing precision. Ika's way is to simply be precise, where it is practical to do so. Maybe she failed your tests because they were the wrong tests.
So yeah, you see sort of Esun has, from the moment she learned she was an origin, right, she had this sort of empirical training, and it was really hardwired into her to think about air pressure and, heat and sort of physics, essentially. Whereas Ika never had anyone to tell her what she was doing, never had anyone tell her the names of stuff. She just had to figure it out on her own, and she used that sort of more intuitive knowledge and very practical knowledge. And she ended up being able to... Can she use magic? She doesn't necessarily know that's what she's doing, that she's doing magic, but, she is.
Mm-hmm.
Asun actually has a really hard time with the magic part, because she was like me, where she was, so in this one understanding of what orogeny is, and it was really hard for her to break out of that, and she had to experience it alongside Ika and see her doing it and feel her doing it, and she realized how it works.
Yeah, it's like in many ways Ika doesn't have this full capacity of orogeny that Esun does, but she doesn't, at the same time, Ika doesn't separate her orogeny from her magic. It's all her power. And so, yeah, maybe she can't have the most precise torus to be able to control a very small thing like a pebble. But when she needs to create a tunnel as an escape route, she creates incredibly beautifully constructed tunnel staircase with right angles, and it's all just compresses the rock away. And it's yeah, who needs to move a pebble?
Yeah.
When you need to build escape routes, that's what you need to be able to do. And I think this leads nicely into this next section when we're talking a little bit more about the trauma, because Ika uses orogeny without the trauma that Essen carries with her from her fulcrum training. And I think that helps Ika be more free to just explore things, because she hasn't been traumatized to think you are going to hurt people, you have to do it this way, this is the only way to succeed. And Essen has seen people punished and killed and lost forever because, or, you never see that person again because they broke the mold of how the fulcrum trained. And it made me think a lot about the kind of idea, hurt people. Of course, origins, especially young origins, are going to be fearful because their whole world around them tells them, origins are terrible and kill people and murderers, they're monsters. And so if you've been kind of traumatized to believe that and you realize you are an origin yourself, that's just a very scary place to start from. And of course, origins are going to kill people if they're acting out of fear because they themselves are going to be killed. It's a self-defense thing. Whereas Ika, we learn her parents were very accepting from the get-go of okay, that's who you are. And trusting of her that she was going to learn how to control her powers and not hurt people. But it doesn't seem like the focus was on oh my gosh, you're a monster, get away from us. It was okay, cool. That's actually really helpful in her calm. And over time, she built the trust and respect of her community because of her skills.
Yeah, and in the first episode, we made the comparison of how orogeny is a kind of expression of someone's fight or flight response, right? It's sort of at the base of your brain, and it's instinctual, and they use it to protect themselves when they're in danger. But it's interesting that it's not that for Ika, actually. It's just a tool. It's a resource that she has within herself. And, actually Esun and Ika have the same resources, but they express them very differently. And also, we spent all of book 1 and a lot of book 2 thinking of orogeny just by what it does in that fight or flight response, in that trauma, outpouring of trauma. But that's not all it is. You know, magic in particular is not trauma related. You know, it's sort of intuitive and interconnecting everything, and it's specifically this other thing. And it really made me think of the way, it made me think of other sort of mental health things, particularly autism, because that's what I spend a ton of time researching, and other, you know, mental health things that are defined by what they look like when they're traumatized, or when they're so bad that they're interrupting everyone's lives, you know, when they're getting in other people's way. Like autism in particular, really defined by what qualities, you know, you think about meltdowns. That only happens to an autistic person who is overwhelmed. That's not like the natural state of being of an autistic person, is to be melting down. That's when things are going very badly. But that's what's visible, that's what people can see, that's maybe included in like a trauma response, and so that's part of the definition. And a ton of other things like that. People, if you're doing okay as an autistic person, you figured out all the resources that you need, you're just chugging along, living your life and taking care of yourself, people don't believe you that you're autistic because you don't exhibit all of the negative, quote-unquote, qualities by which society defines the condition. So then I started going into this whole, like, autism analysis of this book, because I was like, what if I thought of erogyny as autism? And that led me to some very interesting, also very dark places. Because Nasun's story in particular has a pretty strong correlation with autism, because the central conflict between her and her father, the reason that they end up where they end up and her whole, you know, story happens, is because he can't reconcile the fact that the daughter he loves is also this thing that he's been taught to hate. And he can't reconcile those two ideas together. And so he's decided that the erogyny is not part of her. It's a thing that has been done to her, and it needs to be cured from her. That he's somehow lost his daughter. His daughter's been taken from him by this evil erogyny, and he needs to get it out. She needs to be cured. And so he thinks he's doing that out of love, right? To try and rescue her in some way. And he gets angry when they're not actively curing her and instead teaching her how to cultivate her erogyny instead. And eventually she has to tell him, like, Dad, I don't want to be cured. This is a core part of who I am. I would be fundamentally changed as a person if you removed this from me. And I wouldn't be the same. I wouldn't be me. And I like this part of myself. That journey is incredibly, I mean, that's the central fight, essentially, for autistic people, is like the medical system has decided that it's a disease or a condition that interferes, is bothersome. It interferes with other people's lives. And they sort of teach parents that their child has been stolen by this condition. And they need to do all these interventions to make their kids a normal human again. And autistic people are like, no, this is me. This is literally, you can't, it's in my brain. It's my whole brain structure. It's how my whole brain works. If you removed it, my brain wouldn't be, I would be a totally different person. Yeah, so then I started doing, like, my brother and I talk about, we need to come up with an autism theory, like a literary theory.
Yeah, I wanted to take a moment to kind of like talk about what we mean when we say, like, you know, you saying, like, I want to develop autism theory, and when we say, like, if we have a reading of erogyny as neurodivergence or as autism, maybe give us like a little grounding for listeners who maybe haven't spent time with literary theory before, kind of like what that means. Because I don't think, just to clarify for listeners, we're not saying N.K. Jemisin wrote Nasun as a comparison of autistic people.
Oh, no.
Yes. What are we saying when we say autism theory, or a reading of autism?
Yes. So theory, literary theory in particular, it's different ways of seeing. It's the understanding that the same thing can exist, and every single person who looks at it, because of their past experiences and their worldview that they've been taught and all these other things, the way that they see the world, they're going to interpret what they're seeing slightly differently. They're going to experience it slightly differently. So there are a million ways of approaching the same book. You can approach it by trying to figure out what the author intended. What did they mean? You can just go off of, how do I feel while I'm reading this? Which we sort of go into in like our experience reading section, right? That's sort of, how did I feel? That's as much a theory as what I'm doing. So there's feminist theory, there's queer theory, there's a million other things where you're not saying, oh, the author meant this. What you're doing is you're putting on your autism goggles and you're looking at the text and saying, how is this connected to or possibly similar to the autistic experience? How could it maybe, what insight could it give about the autistic experience? Or even just reading it as an autistic person, is there anything that I connect to, connections that I would make that maybe someone who isn't looking for it wouldn't notice? Like with queer theory, it can be very literal, where, you're literally trying to interpret whether a character is queer or not. Or it can be much more metaphorical of like, someone who feels like an outsider, who feels ostracized, who doesn't fit the mold. That can be sort of a queer interpretation of like, oh, someone, the LGBTQ plus community would relate to this person's experience because they are ostracized or they are separate. So those are different theories. That's kind of how theory works.
Yeah, and what I really like about just talking about literary theory, because I'm a nerd, is like being constantly reminded of the fact that we can all bring our own viewpoint into a book, into a text, and so much of it is valid. And when Julie and I were in our, English classes in college and in high school, the best classes were when everyone was super engaged and bringing up their own pieces of evidence. Like in literary theory writing, it's really just based on, can you present convincing evidence for your case? So maybe not everyone's going to be convinced, but if Julie wants to write a piece about, autism theory in the Obelisk Gate, she's just going to start making all these comparisons and pulling quotations from the text. And maybe someone who's like, I never viewed that text this way, now I have a new way to think about it. It just like kind of continues to expand the conversation around a book instead of limiting it to say the book is only saying this. It was a little long-winded to get there, but that's what I was trying to say. What I love about literary theory is that it continues to expand the world of what we're reading. It doesn't limit it. It doesn't say, no, there are not queer characters in this book who aren't identified as queer by the narrator. It's like, oh, well, like, let's explore beyond that. Let's think beyond it and not say like it has to be or doesn't have to be. It's just, do we have enough evidence to make an argument that makes it interesting and expands our worldview of the specific book? And a lot of these theories, as Julia listed some of the prominent ones, they come out of particularly oppressed and marginalized communities staking claim into the literary canon and saying, okay, early on, a lot of the canon was white men. And so women coming in with feminist theory to be like, okay, so how can we read a feminist take on these books that have been set aside just for men, or men have had the opportunity to write fiction for way longer than women have and way more extensively. How can we kind of bring our lens into this space? Same with the queer community and with like other theories, womanist, which is like Black women specifically. All these different readings not only can help expand the canon to be like, let's consider these other stories, but also kind of let's return to these texts that everyone tells us are important or we should read, and let's bring a different point of view to them than maybe others have brought before.
Yeah, especially when there's like a dominant interpretation and someone else comes to the book and is like, actually, that's not what I got from it at all. It allows for a new way of seeing to be sort of made canon, made legitimate. So anyway, we're nerds. One more nerdy
fangirl part is that like, so with things like Julia's autism rate of this, another thing I love about reading is it brings people together about different perspectives and we learn a lot. If someone loves the Obelisk Gate and really relates to Nasun for specific reasons, and Julia will get into more of her autism theory in a moment when I give her back the mic, but maybe you really relate to Nasun and you don't know much about autism, but then you hear Julia's autism read of this, all of a sudden you have a new way of seeing autism. Not only a new way of seeing the book, but a new way of maybe understanding something you don't. So when I read, you know, a womanist reading that's talking about Blackness in a novel, maybe I hadn't thought about it, but then all of a sudden someone else's reading is giving me a new perspective, not only on that novel, but like what it means to be a Black woman in certain spaces. And so that's another like feel good moment. I know academia and sometimes, you know, us book fans can get a little catty about our preferences and our reads and whatnot, but like I hope at the end of the day it's an eye-opening experience for everyone to learn more about the books we read and about the people reading them. Okay. Back to you.
Thanks. And back to you. Yeah. So the other thing that was really eye-opening once I used this autistic lens was the way that Esun trained Nasun.
Yeah.
Is basically she was raising her daughter in an environment where if Nasun expressed visibly any signs of erogyny, she would literally be murdered. And so it was not safe for her to be visibly an origin. And you can the metaphors write themselves. So you know, the way that Esun trained her was very steeped in Esun's own trauma for good reason. You know what I mean? It's really messed up. Like, she literally broke Nasun's hand. Like, she continued the line of that visible sign, that a feeling of trauma in the broken hand. She passed that on, but it was like she didn't know how else to convey the severity of, like, even when her hand was being broken, Nasun could not lose control. She could not visibly be an origin. Otherwise, she would die. And so the surrounding environment was really ultimately to blame for that situation, right? We don't know what would have happened. I mean, we can kind of tell, like, when Esun went by Cyanite and she was raising their son Corundum with Alabaster and Inan on that little island where they thought they were free and safe, right? The way that they were raising their son was quite different because everyone knew that Corundum was an origin and he would be a very powerful one, and there was no rush. He could just sort of learn as he went. And so, yeah, that reminded me so much of how autistic masking works. It's really traumatizing to force an autistic person to mask their behavior, because it gives most of them PTSD. It's extremely stressful. It wears them out, and they feel like they're a failure because they can't be a real human being, and it creates all these problems. But for particularly, you know, more marginalized communities, it keeps them alive. Like, there are so many Black autistic men in particular who get killed or put in prison for just being visibly autistic and they haven't done anything wrong. So, like, there is a wider society that is not allowing for these different people to be also human, and Esun has to train Nasun how to mask first rather than how to explore the fullness of her power.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very upsetting. And then she latches onto Shafa, because Shafa's the only one who doesn't try to tell her to stop or to hide, even though he's like the worst person ever.
Okay, so Shafa is so interesting because we meet him in book 1 and we don't like him, and he is very much a antagonist because he is, as we all know, he is Esun's guardian, and something happens to him though. Like, you know, he kind of almost dies in the boat explosion that Esun, or as Cyanite, created, and we get this scene kind of like last time on the Broken Earth trilogy at the beginning where it's like we pick up with Shafa like right after that moment, and like something saves him and he makes some sort of like compromise in order to live again, but we don't really know and we don't get a lot of details, and it's kind of messy. So it's like really difficult when we first meet Shafa again in book 2 because we're like, we do not like you. Mm-hmm. But it's so complicated because he ends up being Nasun's support and like protector and allows her to safely live her life and explore her power away from her father, who wants her to fix herself or be dead. But yeah, we have these moments where it's like heartbreaking when Nasun accidentally turns another origin at the training center she's at into stone. She's like crying and she's like saying, oh my gosh, like I'm a monster or whatever. And Shafa says, but you are my monster. And then narration continues. She is so low and horrified that this actually makes her feel better. And it's like, oh, so difficult because you're like, oh, we have a reason to maybe start liking Shafa again, but he's still kind of a dick.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, yeah, you're right, you're a monster, but you're my monster. Instead of being like, you're not a monster. Oh.
Yeah. He's still using her for something, but we don't quite know what. Like, he still has his own agenda, and he's still very cold and calculating and emotionally detached, but because he is so protective of her and supportive of this thing that everyone tells her she has to hide, she just latches onto that. It's imperfect. You know, it's an imperfect situation, but it's better than her being stuck at home with her dad, who's probably gonna kill her. Like, ugh.
Yeah, and if we put on those lenses, if we're reading this as a book about trauma, when someone is experiencing so much trauma and abuse in other elements of their life, you know, we can see Nasun making decisions. One, she's young, she's 10 years old, and she has not felt safety otherwise. And so she is not equipped to make other decisions. So it's like very difficult and hard to read. So I'm really intrigued to see what happens in book 3 and how much more we understand about Shafa. Because speaking of what side is Shafa on, what even are the sides of this conflict in the stillness / on the planet?
It's so complicated, and I spent so much of this book being like, wait, whose side are they on, and what do they want?
I know, I just, like, anytime I got confused, I would keep reading, so I'm like, I'll figure it out, and I'm like, I still didn't figure it out.
It's hard for me to tell, also, I'm not 100% sure, like, if there's just some stuff that we haven't been told yet, and we'll learn as, like, a reveal in book 3 versus like what we're supposed to have kept track of and just haven't. You know, I was never quite sure, like, am I supposed to know what those are? The thing that's complicated is like book 2 of a sort of magical dystopian trilogy, right? Normally what you'd get is like your protagonist is sort of moving further or higher up the food chain to sort of these bigger, badder bosses, you know, of this sort of government conspiracy something. You know what I mean? Like, who's behind the curtain? That's usually where you go in a book 2. But instead, in this book, what we get is, like, ideology and battles over, like, who counts as a person and trying to figure out who the sort of larger powers are who are competing over something. And they all want different things. Yeah. So Alabaster says there are the 3 main sides and then a bunch of other little ones within those.
Yes. I think if I remember right, you know, those 3 sides are the people or beings that want it to be the same to like maintain the status quo. Mm-hmm. There are people who want to change things for quote unquote the better. And then people who want to change things to retain power, we think. But then when we try to assign, okay, this character is in what side, it gets a little complicated because I'm like, I don't really know.
Because you try to mesh that with what they say they want, and it doesn't fully make sense.
Yeah.
The way that I sort of organize it is the neutrals, the antis, and the anti-lifers. That's sort of how I organize it in terms of what they want. So, like, the neutrals are, like, Alabaster and Hoa, I think. But I'm not 100% sure that Hoa's on this side, but I think he is. And now Essun, where what they want to do is catch the moon, pull it back into stable orbit around the Earth so that the seasons will end and Father Earth will be appeased because his son was brought back. Then the humans will be happy because the seasons are over and then everyone can just go home. Those are the neutrals. Like, they're not really on a side, I think. Mm-hmm. So they're the ones who want to make things better? Maybe? Okay, and then you have the antis, who I think there's the gray one, we don't know his name, so we just call him the Gray One in all caps.
I think Esun calls him Steel, but it's described as the same person.
Yeah.
The same Stone Eater, yeah.
So Hoa says that the Grey One wants to prevent Esun from wrangling the moon because he wants all the humans to die. But then this same Stone Eater, who supposedly wants all the humans to die, goes to Nasun and asks her to catch the moon. And she's like, okay, that makes sense. Crazy. Even though Hoa says that's not what he wants, because right now, as it stands, Esun and Nasun have the same mission. But I think he's lying. I think she's being tricked, and so what does he want? He wants everything to blow up, I think, but I'm not sure how.
Yeah, I'm curious how much the Grey One is being a mastermind. Is he trying to have Nasun go for the moon because her mother is too, and therefore they'll destroy each other? Or does he just want to go see people burn and, is angry at Hoa and Esun?
I think we haven't been given insight into the full complexities of the Stone Eater politics yet.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we'll get that more. We need Hoa's backstory, because he has a specific agenda. We don't fully know what it is. Yeah. Besides protecting Esun.
Yeah, because I think we're going to get the story of how Hoa ended up in the obelisk.
The broken one?
Yeah, we find out in book 2, that Esun, as Cyanite, when she grabs the obelisk in book 1, and she comes face to face with the Stone Eater who's stuck in it, we come to learn later that Hoa, who is disguising himself as a child so that Esun would like him and let him follow her around, is that same Stone Eater, and all we get in book 2 is that he pissed off the wrong origins. So I feel like we're going to figure out who those origins were, what they were trying to do, how did he piss them off to end up in the obelisk. I feel like that's going to tell us some stuff.
Yeah. And then the most complicated one is Shafa, because as a guardian, we learn the guardians are created by placing a piece of iron in their heads, and it channels the will or the voice of Father Earth. So when he's drowning, that voice in his head that was saying, give yourself to me if you want to live, it was Father Earth. And so he said, okay. And so he sort of gave over his brain, for the most part, to the voice and will of Father Earth, I think. And it's slowly trying to take over, even though we know he's trying to fight it. We do know that he is. But it's not clear whose side he used to be on and whose side he's on now. It's hard to know if what he's doing now is in line with what the Guardians wanted originally, because we don't really know what side they were on to begin with. Were they just using the Earth for their own power and purposes, or are they the agents of Father Earth on the Earth? And so did he used to be on that side and now he's on a different one? Is he now doing the will of the Earth, or does he have his own plan? Yeah, it's not clear what he wants personally. And he never says whether he's obeying what the thing wants or not, and whether it's different from what other Guardians want. So that one's really complicated, because I think the Earth is a side. The Earth hates all living things, which includes Stone Eaters, and just wants to kill them all.
Yeah. It's complicated, and we still don't know. This was slightly helpful for me. I don't know if it'll be helpful to any of you listeners. I started thinking a little bit about, okay, who's Father Earth and the origins and the Stone Eaters and where did people come from? I'm confused. I started to think a little bit of it like Greek mythology, and it helped me make a little more sense of it, because Greek mythology starts with Earth Mother and Sky Father, and in the stillness, that means we have Father Earth and his son, the moon. And then there's kind of the first class, the first race, the first peoples of some kind. In Greek mythology are the Titans, and in this book it would be the Stone Eaters, because they're the oldest, they've been around the longest, they have beef, they live a long time. And then the newest are the Origins, and in Greek mythology it's the Olympians. Okay, it gets a little different here because the Origins are still considered human, they have shorter lifespans than the Olympians did, but bear with me through this analogy. What helped me was realizing, oh right, in Greek mythology, while the Olympians versus the Titans is classic conflict, there are some Olympians and there are some Titans who don't really fall into one camp or the other, or have more nuanced desires and ambitions and goals, they aren't one monolith all believing the same thing, which is what Hoa is constantly trying to remind Alabaster and Essen and Ika and a bunch of others. Like, Stone Eaters don't all want one thing. Mm-hmm. We are not all the same team working against the same people. There's many of us on many sides of this battle. So I think that's, like, the main thing to remember is that, like, okay, yes, you can categorize who is a Stone Eater and who is an Origin, but you can't know what side they're on based on their quote-unquote race or whatever you would consider them, because they're all people.
Yeah, and the way that they sort of use people for their, like, humans, you know.
Yeah, using humans as pawns, that's, like, a big deal in both Greek mythology and in this book, is in the same way maybe different Olympians would champion demigods. Now I'm really blasting away my analogies. You could think of, like, the Stone Eaters championing some of the Origins. Ooh, maybe that's a better comparison. Instead of Titans being Stone Eaters and Olympians being Origins, it'd be like Olympians being Stone Eaters and Origins being demigods.
The Guardians as well are, like, their own kind of race of people in a way, because they're modified, but they live through the seasons. They live for centuries. And they essentially set up puppet governments so that the Stills think that they're in charge. And then they control the Origins in order to maintain power, in order to make the Earth stable and all this kind of stuff. But really, it's the Guardians who are in charge.
Yeah.
They're the ones who run shit.
So maybe there's not, like, a direct parallel. There's only a parallel to say everyone has their own agendas. Yeah. And if you can't keep track of which Greek gods hate which Greek gods in the same way, we can't keep track of which characters are on what side of all these conflicts.
Mm-hmm. The heart of the matter that I keep coming back to, like, rather than thinking about the sides, the thing that helps me simplify it is thinking about, okay, what's the central problem? The problem was that they threw the moon away. So, Stone Eaters used to be people, and they were practicing their magic, and I don't know if it was on purpose or on accident, but they were like, whoops, there goes the moon. And Father Earth was like, what did you do with my son? Why did you do this? And then everything kind of went to shit, and he turned the people into stone eaters, to try and neutralize them. And so Father Earth is pissed at all living things. Very mad. Until they bring his son back. So, like, that's the central issue. And everyone has different ideas of how to resolve it, whether it should be resolved. And, you know, it's been going on, the war's been going on for so long, and not everyone understands where it came from, that, you know, there are sort of little petty fights that happen as a result that are not totally related, but are, like, part of it, and, you know, politics. Anyway.
Like the calm that comes to try to, like, take over them and their resources, when it's like, this season is projected to last thousands of years. Taking over our little community is not really going to solve anyone's problem. The bigger problem is the moon is gone.
But it's been gone for so long, people don't know it exists.
Yeah. The big, like, you know, reveal at the end of book 1 is that, have you ever heard of a moon?
Yeah.
And you're like, wait, they don't have a moon?
Yeah.
I don't know if that was helpful to anyone, but we're going to go find book 3 and figure a lot more out. And maybe we'll come back after book 3 and be like, we still don't know. Let's go reread these. Or maybe we'll have some more answers.
Or be like, yeah, everything we said last episode was wrong. Don't listen to it.
So for people enjoying this series, what would you recommend they read next?
I've just been reading books for this season of the podcast and anthropology texts. So I'm instead going to recommend books in a similar genre that have been recommended to me by my friends, which I have not read yet. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but it's called Piranesi by Susanna Clark, The Three Body Problem by Lou Sesshin, and then This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amar El-Motar. All come very highly recommended by people whose taste I trust. So I'm going to say those.
Nice. I mentioned this earlier in the episode, but if you want to read more of Jemisin's work, she's written a lot. So it'll take a while until you finish it all. But I'm most interested to pick up the volume of comics for Far Sector, the DC Green Lantern comics that she wrote. They publish them all as one volume. So for people like me who don't usually like go to the comic book store to pick up like new issues super regularly, I'm excited to see that like the whole series is like combined into one, which I will probably buy next time I'm at the store. And obviously read book 3 of this trilogy, The Stone Sky. Julie and I will be back probably in the fall with The Stone Sky because we have lots of other exciting books we want to get to this summer. Last but not least, things that are bringing us joy, things we're currently obsessed with. I don't have much, but Florence and the Machine dropped a new album today, and I cannot wait to listen. Julie and I went to a Florence concert back in 2019 in Chicago when she was on tour with her last album, and honestly, it was an amazing experience. Like I can't even rank it as my favorite concert because I felt like more than a concert.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It was incredible. So I'm like very excited for the new album, but like I'm also a little nervous because I loved the last one so much that I'm like trying to lower my expectations and be like, I think it'll be good, but maybe it won't like change my life in the same way.
I've listened to about 3/4 of it and I'm really enjoying it, but it is very different, I think. Okay, I've got a list. Things have piled up in the last month while we weren't recording. So we'll start with music. 3 other albums have dropped that I would recommend. So Kehlani has a new album. The Head and the Heart has a new album. And then TXT has a new mini album. I've been listening to... I started doing this other job with Victoria. It's a lot of like, menial labor. And I needed something to listen to that would occupy my thoughts. So I've started listening to a narrative podcast. It's like but it's a very, very popular. It's called the Magnus Archives. It's an anthology where like each one there's like a different monster. It's like Doctor Who for adults in a podcast. And then 2 shows I would recommend, both on HBO Max. I have not shut up about Our Flag Means Death at all in the last 3 weeks of my life, but I gotta say it again because it is a wonderful boost of serotonin in a dark, dark world. So if you like Taika Waititi comedies and that kind of tone, or if you like gay pirates, or just a good time, then this is the show for you. Or found family stories, if that makes you feel good, trust me, you want to spend some time here. And then another very feel-good show that's sort of absurdist, but very soothing and sweet is called Joe Pera Talks With You. They're literally 10-minute episodes and earnest in the most strange way possible, but it's very soothing. His voice is very soothing. So it's a very particular taste, but I really love it. I watch one before bed.
Wonderful. We'll catch you guys on our next episode. Happy reading.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julie and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJB, on our website, bookclubwithjb.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gesme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.